Recording.
Okay. Hello, welcome everyone. If I could ask you to mute yourself at the moment until we get started, that would be great, just to make sure there's no echo in the background. We're just going to give it another minute for a few more folks to join in. Oh, Jacob, can I ask you to help monitor the, thank you. I'm gonna make you a co-host. Awesome, thank you.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone.
I have a problem tracking it. I need to have the track.
Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today for JCC Association's first JDAAIM, Jewish Disability Awareness, Acceptance, and Inclusion Month program. We are so excited today to welcome Rabbi Julia Watts-Belzer for a program entitled Resisting Ableism and Cultivating Access, Disability, and Jewish Social Justice. And this is such a special moment to me for a lot of reasons, because I have known Julia for a very long time and actually met her when I was a grad student many years ago, and she's really influenced my work in this field. So I feel so fortunate to be here today with her, to learn with her, and for all of you to have the opportunity as well. Before we get started and I introduce Julia's background a little bit more, just a few points for you all to be aware of. Closed captioning is available for our call today, so feel free to turn that on for yourself if that would be helpful. I also ask if you would feel comfortable to turn on your cameras so that Julia can see all of you as she's presenting and not just be presenting to a screen with different names. That would be very much appreciated. And I also just want to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Sierra Weiss. I am the Access and Inclusion Specialist for JCC Association. I use she, her pronouns, and I am sitting in our office today. And I'm a white woman with short brown curly hair, wearing glasses and a burgundy sweater. And I am so excited to see so many familiar faces and also many new ones. So thank you for joining us today. Let me just go. I remembered to turn on the recording, thanks to Julia's reminder. So we today in this workshop will examine how Jewish communities can create cultures of accessibility and integrate disability into our commitments to Jewish social justice. We'll bring classical Jewish texts into conversation with the lived experiences of contemporary disability activists to explore ways to better recognize and resist ableism. We'll dive into spiritual and practical strategies for challenging normativity and consider ways to build communities that invite disabled Jews to unfurl the brilliance of our embodied difference. And again, this will be led by Julia Watts-Belzer, a rabbi, scholar, and spiritual teacher, as well as a longtime activist for disability, LGBTQ, and gender justice. Her newest book is Loving Our Own Bones, Disability Wisdom and the Spiritual Subversiveness of Knowing Ourselves Whole. She is a professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Georgetown University and core faculty in Georgetown's Disability Studies program, as well as a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Author of Rabbinic Tales of Destruction, among other scholarly books, she has held faculty fellowships at Harvard Divinity School and the Katz Center for Advanced Jewish Studies. She's also an avid wheelchair hiker and lover of wild places. And with that, I'm so excited to turn things over to Julia, who will lead us through our time together today. And hopefully we'll have the opportunity to learn together and think of ways that we can be more open and inclusive in our own JCC communities. So Julia, I'll turn it over to you now.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Sierra, for that wonderful introduction. And also thank you so much to all of you for being here today. It's wonderful to see a lot of faces. It makes me so happy. Please do feel warmly welcome, though, to inhabit this space and our time together in whatever way works for you. So if it does work for you to be cameras on, amazing. But of course, no problem. Whatever you need to do, go in and out, take care of your own body, mind, eat, drink, nourish yourself in whatever way you need to. I'm so glad that we have this time to be together. What I'd like to do today is to share a few thoughts and reflections based on my recent book, and then also to enter into some time of engaging and talking together about questions of ableism and accessibility, and particularly creating cultures of accessibility and access that really deeply invite and welcome the transformative presence of disability into Jewish life and community. As I said, I'll give a little intro at the start, but I've also come with some texts in the hopes that we might dive in together. So I will welcome you to be engaged conversation partners with me, and I hope that you're game for that. So more of that in a moment. But let me just say a few words at the start about my most recent book, Loving Our Own Bones, Disability Wisdom and the Spiritual Subversiveness of Knowing Ourselves Whole. The book really dives deep into the question of ableism and disability injustice, thinking about how that plays out both in sacred texts and in contemporary culture. It's laying out a spiritual and a political invitation to reimagine our world and our cultural and religious traditions in ways that honor the vibrant complexity of all our actual bodies and minds. You know, in part because I've spent more than a decade now as a scholar of rabbinic texts, and particularly a scholar of disability and gender and rabbinic literature. People often ask me the question, what does Jewish tradition say about disability? And so, of course, you know, in my scholarly life, I do focus on that question. I think about how disability and difference unfold in Midrash and in Talmud. But in Loving Our Own Bones, I got the chance to flip that question on its head. And instead, my core question is, what can disability offer to Jewish tradition? What wisdom and insight does disability experience bring to Torah, to spiritual practice, to the work of building community? And so when Sierra and I were talking together about this time with all of you as JCC professionals, right, it was really that question that felt so juicy, right? To think about not just how disabled folks can be sort of like invited in, but also what happens when disability is alive and present at the very center of what Jewish community is and is about. So in my work, I lift up what I call disability wisdom, profound, powerful, cultural, often countercultural work that I see happening in disability communities. I'm thinking here about like the work of honoring and affirming bodies and minds in their fullness and in their complexity, pushing back against silence and stigma and shame. I'm thinking about some of the really innovative ways that I've seen disability communities begin to develop strategies for practicing collective care, for what it means to really show up for each other, even when it's complicated, probably actually, especially when it's complicated. And I'm also really interested in insurgent practices for resisting ableism, for ways of like cracking open the tight, constricting, one-size-fits-all spaces, what we often call hegemonic norms, right? There's different systems and practices and messages that insist there's only one right way to have a body, there's only one good way to move through the world, only one acceptable pace, like full speed ahead, only one right way of thinking or feeling or perceiving. All of that, is that message comes through so powerfully in so many ways. And yet, for me, that message is a lie, right? I mean, at the center of my own spiritual, ethical, religious, and political commitments is a commitment to saying, I want disabled people in the world, right? And I want us to be fully a part of all of the communities, spaces, cultures, places that we inhabit. So let me pause and just say a word about what I mean by disability. When I talk about disability, I think about disability very expansively. It's a broad, complex, many-faceted category. So by disability, I mean to include things, sensory disabilities, physical disabilities, cognitive and intellectual disabilities, things like neurodivergence and neurodiversity, mental health disabilities like depression, anxiety, chronic illness, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, long COVID. Right? I myself am a wheelchair user, so my disability is often, at least in many contexts, highly visible for sighted folks. But as the sort of Zoom environment makes plain, this very notion of like what's visible, what's not visible, even for sighted folks, is a kind of complicated business. Actually, I think it's really crucial to bear in mind that most disabilities are not immediately apparent. And so I think that actually leads me to what has been one of the most revolutionary insights in my own life and experience, is to begin expecting disability everywhere. I now try to move through the world assuming disabled people are always already present in every space that we inhabit, right? So in our own Zoom room, like, hello, disabled folks, right? I don't know who you are, but like the assumption that we're here, right, changes something really significant about the way I approach my own work and the way that I move through the world. It's been a real shift in my own life. Growing up with a disability, I often felt like I was the only disabled person in the room. Honestly, I often felt like I was the only disabled person on the planet. Right? No one talked about disability unless it was in really like sweet, saccharine ways that made me want to hide. Right? And so I also really learned to minimize disability, to say as little as possible about it, to shrink down, to like make it take up as little space as possible. And that was both painful, but also really isolating. For me, claiming disability was a very crucial turning point, a kind of politicization around my own thinking about disability identity, but also a way of beginning to recognize disability as an ordinary part of life, a kind of neutral descriptor of who I am, not something that needs to be apologized for. And eventually that transformed into thinking about disability as a potent, meaningful source of insight in my life, a set of experiences that have really shaped certainly my spiritual life, but also my sense of politics, my way of inhabiting the world, and have guided me toward deeper relationships and a deeper understanding, particularly around what it means to challenge ableism. So when I think about ableism, I think about a complicated set of social structures, policies, norms, and attitudes that marginalize people with disabilities and also people who are thought or assumed to be disabled. Ableism goes hand in hand. It gets intertwined with a whole lot of other systems of oppression. When I think about ableism, I'm always also thinking about power, the way that certain bodies and minds get treated as normal, while others get cast as abnormal, deviant, inferior, or undesirable. I think one of the things that's been really significant for me, though, is that recognizing that ableism is not just about how people think or feel. I was originally really taught to think about disability primarily in terms of stigma, right? And of course, it is about stigma, but it's also about concrete, tangible practices, the way we've built this world, to work for some people and not for others. The way, for example, we often expect everyone to work at the same pace or to think in the same way, to process information in the same way, to manage the feelings, to move through the world in the same tight, narrow way. So I want to, by way of kind of opening up this question about ableism, particularly thinking about ableism in relation to Jewish texts, I want to go ahead and share my promised text handout. So I've got it as a Google Doc, so that if you're the kind of person who would like to have a text in front of you, you're welcome to click in, and you can make it as big or as small as you would like. But I'd like to take a look at this text number 1, the Wicked City, from the Babylonian Talmud. It's a text from Bavli Sanhedrin 109b. So this is a lengthy passage in the Talmud where the rabbis are they're talking about the wickedness of the city of Sodom. I always, as a queer person myself, I always get a little flinchy about the very name Sodom. So I always feel I should just put a little disclaimer out there that when the rabbis are talking about Sodom and Sodom as a wicked city, right, and the quintessential wicked city, they're not talking about sexuality at all. They're really talking about a city that was known to them as a cruel city, because of the way that it treated strangers, marginalized folks, people living in poverty, people who were wayfarers, immigrants, right? And so there's an extraordinary set of teachings in the Talmud, in Tractate Sanhedrin, where the rabbis lay out the nature of this wicked city's cruelty, right? What did the people do that was so horrendous, right? And this passage that I'd love to share is taken from that larger litany, right? So one of the things that the wicked city was known for is, I'll read here the text. They had a certain bed on which they laid all guests. If he was too tall, they cut off his feet. If he was too short, they stretched him to fit. Right? So the rabbis are imagining here a kind of city in which every traveler, every guest, right, is taken and forced to lie down in a single bed and made to fit. And I'd love to just get your reflections, reactions. What do you notice about the text? What questions does it raise for you? If you want to link it back to some of what I was talking about ableism, that would be great. I'd love to, any thoughts, reactions, or observations you'd like to share about the text? You're welcome to unmute. If you'd like to be called upon, you can raise your hand. You can also feel free to use the chat if you'd like. But yeah, curious if this text about the bed resonates. Jacob.
Hi, first of all, thank you for being here today. It's such an honor to be learning from you and with all this incredible group. It reminds me a lot of that very classic image about equality, equity, justice, etc., with the boxes and the folks standing on it to watch the ball game or whatever is going on in the background. It reminds me of a lot, like, in theory, this sounds like the most equitable thing, like everyone will fit on the bed the same exact way, but ultimately what it causes the individual and the community to experience is far more harmful to the collective and to the individual than what the original intention, however well-intentioned the people of Sodom were trying to be. It doesn't necessarily reflect the ultimate outcome and how people experience this idea of equity or justice they're trying to sum up here. So it really reminds me a lot of that image, and it's so fascinating that this text connects to that in that way for me.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I think that's really interesting, right? Because that kind of classic image, right, is also built around the idea of body sizes being different, right? So that if everyone is standing on the same platform, right? Some people get a great view and some people only get, thank you very much, Sierra, for linking to that image. Some people only get to see the fence, right? In this text too, we have that image, the sort of recognition, actually, that human bodies are radically different, right? This idea, this investment that everyone is going to fit in the same bed, right, doesn't work without doing tremendous violence, right, to the body. Right? Other thoughts? Great, Orna.
I'll just say, I mean, you just sort of jumped ahead of me a little bit, but the damage that can come from demand and conformity,
Right.
and how, you know, this actually, Jacob, I totally resonate with what you said, but also, like, to me, it said Cinderella, the original story, like cutting off the back of the foot to fit into the shoe, and how painful it is, it physically and emotionally, to be demanded to conform to something that doesn't fit you.
Yeah, I think that really resonates with me, Orna, particularly that image of the right, the damage that gets right, that glass slipper image, right, is actually in its original telling so violent, right? I mean, the presence of the presence of pain in that story is, I think, something also here that certainly when the rabbis are imagining the wicked city, they aren't thinking about a city that means well. They're actually thinking about a city that is willing to cut off, right, the feet that don't fit, right? And it is this extraordinarily violent image, right, of forcing a body into a bed or a box, right, that isn't, right, that doesn't allow it enough room. Abe.
Hi, pleasure to be here. I think for me, it's about the bed, and the bed is a place of comfort. The bed is a place of, that's where I go at the end of the day to relax. That's where I embrace my partner in a loving way. That's the place of intimacy, comfort, sexuality. Like that's like, I'm in my bed, thank God. And it's like, you know what they did in the bed? Like it's like, it's like so startling and awful. Because like, I think, you hear like, oh, and they brought the guests to the bed. You're like, oh, nice. What did they do there? Did they sit down? Did they have tea together? Did like they cozy up in blankets? And it's like, no, they did not do that. So just thinking about I don't know, the ways that we welcome people or think that we're welcoming people into spaces, what we're unaware that we're doing, what we're actively doing, what that experience is like. It's just kind of, it's kind of stirring that up for me.
That is such an interesting and potent juxtaposition that you're offering here, right? The way the bed could be is certainly, I think a lot of folks with whom I'm in disability community with have like a love affair with the idea of like finally being able to sink into bed, right? So much of life is difficult, but the bed is the space of spaciousness and rest and blankets and like heating pads and whatever, right? And here, as you're saying, so right on, the bed becomes not a space of comfort, but a place of constriction and violence and brutality. Okay. Did I miss someone's hand earlier? Did Sasha?
I'm actually like just really struck by the active nature of this. Like I think about, I myself am a tall person. And I notice in children's books, there's never tall or short characters. All the children are always the same height. And so I think it's really interesting, even that they're very much acknowledging that there are distinct differences between people and then creating the violence for that difference.
Right.
Like there is this opportunity to they're not saying everyone's the same. They're saying everyone is different and we don't care. Like everyone is different and we must be like us. It's not trying to put everyone in saying that they're the same at all.
Really, really interesting observation, right? So this sort of interest in, I'm struck also by Alyssa's observation in the chat, right? If when when the sort of disparity does appear sometimes, I think this is in children's literature, right? They comment explicitly on the tall and short children and point it out. So we have sometimes this like desire for the sort of imaginary sort of ubiquitous sameness, or a really sharp dichotomy of the tall one, the short one, right? I think one of the things that most that most gets under my skin about this text is like, what gives, Sodom? Why do you care? Right? If the person is too tall or too short for the bed, right? Like, what does it hurt you? Right? If the feet hang over a little bit, and particularly with the one who's too short, like, why you got to stretch him out so he like maximizes the availability of every square inch, right? It's just bizarre. Elisa. Alyssa, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you for your insight so far. And I have to think and wonder, based on what you just said, isn't it easier to just build another bed? Or actually, when I heard this first text, like, I actually pictured Goldilocks with 3 beds and 3 sizes and just being a little bit more inclusive, and everyone will find the right place.
Yes, yes, yes. This, I mean, I think this is why I like teaching this text as a way of thinking about the material like the way that ableism, right, and disability inequity often gets enacted through physical environments, through cultural environments, right? Architecture is often used as a parade example here. The bed really orients us toward thinking about bodies and body size, right? But we can also think about this in terms of other kinds of norms and expectations, right? The amount of time someone is allocated, right, to read a document, the expectation of how fast a person can walk, right? All of these assumptions that get encoded into our physical spaces and our cultural norms about how we collectively move through space, or how we are with one another, right, is, I think, one of the really the concrete ways that ableism gets enacted in the world, right? The friction that certain bodies, certain minds experience when we, right, when we're asked to continually inhabit, move through, or navigate spaces that are not built for each other, for ourselves, right? And this is where I think that really helpful question, right? Wouldn't it be better to just build a different bed, right, is at the core of what I think we are about when we commit to really integrating access, accessibility, right, centering disability, right? It's in some ways it's about anticipating the likelihood, right, of the need for a bunch of different beds, right? Goldilocks here is a great example, right? Like, have a wide variety of beds available, but also recognizing that I think in my own life, I've also come to realize that while there's a lot that I can anticipate, there's a lot that I should anticipate. And the more time I spend immersed in disability communities, the better I get at anticipating possibilities. It also requires a kind of reorientation toward thinking about the moment of encounter, right? Guest, here you are, invited, right, into this space. Oh, look, the bed doesn't fit, right? In that moment, then, it's also, I think, for me, the practice of like deliberately trying to turn away from the violent impulse that says, well, we'll just wrench you, your body, your mind, your comfort, wrench you into a different shape so you fit the pre-existing structure. The work that I am committed to doing is to saying, let's take apart the structure and reimagine the world in which we live. So I think that, I mentioned, as I said, the bed text, right? The Sodom text gets us to think here, particularly about the built environment, about the physicality of so many spaces and places. But I think when I think about one of the ways that ableism unfolds in this world, I am so struck particularly by the way it often runs hand in hand with productivity culture, right? With certain kinds of like hyper-capitalist modes of like doing, producing, accomplishing, accounting for oneself that turn our ability to work and to work in a very particular kind of way into an assessment of our worth. This to me feels like one of the most pervasive cultural messages that runs through so many spaces, Jewish spaces, not Jewish spaces, right? This is like a ubiquitous voice in at least the cultures in which I find myself moving. So pervasive and such a lie, right? That sense that we are only as good as our last accomplishment, that we owe a kind of continual productivity and work-oriented, production-oriented accomplishment as a kind of litmus test for basic belonging. I think a lot about this when I think about ableism, because of course this brutal culture of efficiency above all else, right, is often one of the things that makes, right, it's often one of the dynamics that makes ableism tick. I often, when we're trying to like feel ableism really hit home, I think when we start going fast, when we start rushing, when we start thinking we're under pressure, right, it often really ratchets up those dynamics. I think that for me, one of the things that's been really significant Jewishly in terms of rethinking this kind of American culture drive to produce, right, which is such a deep part of my own lived experience, has been the practice of Shabbat. In my book, I talk a lot about the practice of keeping Sabbath, the practice of honoring rest, and how that has the potential to be profoundly liberatory. I've got a little paragraph from the book. I pulled a paragraph from the book onto the handout about the way I started keeping Shabbat in graduate school, which is not, of course, the time when most folks decide to set aside 25 hours each week for rest and rejuvenation. I write in the book, I can still remember how scandalous it felt, how subversive it was to come back to my dorm room and begin the ritual of unwinding my mind from the endless clutch of assignments, deadlines, worries, and work. No matter what I had to do, no matter what I'd left undone. On Friday night, I surrendered to the setting sun. I'd set out my tea lights, take a breath, strike the match, chant the blessings, and let the world turn to shadow and to gold. I would sit in the dark for hours, watching the candle flames flicker. Some nights I would read a novel. Some nights I would doze. Mostly I would sing, softly, without words, sing myself back home. So I'd love to open up a little conversation with you now, think with you together about some of the ways in which this kind of the power, the potential of Shabbat to be a kind of antidote to at least certain forms of ableism, the assumption that there's a kind of expectation of work as a measure of worth, of production and productivity as a marker of human belonging, of who's worth centering, who's worth paying attention to. I think for me, this is also really intense when I think about what does it mean to create cultures of accessibility and of disability welcome, not just right? Not just for guests, but also for folks who work in Jewish communities, right? I'm thinking here about so many Jewish professionals I know who struggle with the ways in which the norms and expectations, the rhythms of our day-to-day lives, right, often reward a very, very particular kind of labor and productivity and showing up, and leave less space for spaciousness, for care, for rest. Been thinking about this so much as I've been working with and in conversation with a number of rabbis with chronic illness, or folks who are dealing with effects of long COVID, right? Trying to navigate the question of what does it mean to create spaces, to imagine leadership, work environments, ways of being together, ways of being in community, that value us, right? In the words of disability justice advocate Patty Byrne, value us for who we are, not what we can do. And I think, yeah, want to again just kind of leave a little space here for your thoughts, for your reflections, for your questions. For me, this has been a kind of question about thinking about the way that ableism hurts all of us. Of course, ableism hits hardest against disabled folks, especially multiply marginalized disabled folks. But it's not actually good for anyone with a body. None of us have bodies or minds that can always run like clockwork, right? That can always keep on pushing. We all need rest. We all need care. We all need gentleness. So just leave a space here if folks have thoughts or questions or reflections, whether about the text or the piece that you're thinking about here in this question of rest. Welcome to share. I think one of the things that has been particularly interesting for me has been thinking about what does it mean to build a kind of build a Shabbat practice that actually centers my own body, mind's needs, right? Which doesn't always mean hosting a big gathering and cooking a big dinner, right? Which sometimes means the pajama Shabbos, right? I think I'm really interested in sort of thinking about what other ways of being, right, might not always push us toward the go, 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 the do, do, do. For me, it's a really ongoing project of working to unwind and rewind this, right? These very deep-seated messages that who we are, right, is more than our work. Really appreciating a comment that's coming in the chat about from Stephanie about how it's considered normal for Jewish nonprofit workers to be overworked and underpaid, and how hard it is to shift that culture. It's difficult and unhealthy for able-bodied neurotypical folks, let alone people who are disabled and neurodivergent, right? And I think that's really right, really wise, this recognition here that that culture of always on, right? Always on, of course, exacts, right, the hardest tolls from folks who most need, right, most need rest and spaciousness, right? But actually also, in some ways, that's all of us, right? This is one of the things that leads me to say that this, right, to the extent that ableism is often like pushing us always to build up that culture of accomplishment, productivity, more. It's really hard on all of us. And I think a really subversive thing that we can do in our workspaces is to think about ways, right, of generatively cutting all of ourselves some more slack. Building ways of like building strategies for mutual support and covering for each other. But this is also, right, I mean, I'll tell you a story. When I first started keeping Shabbat, right, in grad school, those taking those 25 hours out of my schedule for rest, right, I assumed I would just like shove the my regularly existing life, which had previously been on those 7 days, into 6, right? I just work harder in order to allow myself, right, rest. And I think one of the hardest things to realize, the hardest things to internalize was actually, right, that getting off the ableism train meant saying, I can't do that. This is too much, right? Readjusting the expectations, the demands, the requirements. So I think, yeah, I raise this. It's a tough question. I think it's a difficult question. It's certainly one that's been alive for me for more than a decade and remains unresolved. But it feels to me a really powerful and potent question for thinking about challenging some of the deep dynamics and root causes of ableism and violence. So, oh, really appreciating this comment from Emily in the chat about the way Emily's department is currently undergoing some restructuring, an instinct to work harder and longer to prove that I am still valuable to the team. And I'm just really moved there by what your boss said. You don't need to hustle for your worth. It's extraordinary. What a gift when we can offer that to each other. Powerful, powerful. I want to, as we're thinking about this, ways to crack open more space of kind of being together in ways that build and create cultures of care, I want to move into thinking here about this question of accessibility and access. I think one of the ways that a culture of care operates for me is by really centering accessibility, access, right, as a kind of core values commitment. When I think about access, I think first and foremost about normalizing the fact that disability is a part of people's lives. Whether it's a part of their individual lives, a part of their family systems, right? Disability is in some ways a part of almost all of our lives, if not now, likely will be at some point in the future. So when I think about access, I really think about trying to shift away from the idea of access as a sort of like unexpected aberration in the ordinary flow of things, into a way that folds access questions into the everyday heart of what it means to be together and to work together. So I think about access as at their core, right? Access is a question of hospitality, about relationships, about belonging, not a one and done checklist. Of course, there are foundational access practices that we can and should integrate as a basic commitment to welcome. Right? And so I think that the checklist is certainly helpful as a kind of threshold, basic part of thinking about like, oh, making sure I've set a good table, right? And haven't just set out a one size fits all bed, right? But for me, so much about the kind of commitment to thinking more deeply about access is to creating a culture where people are invited, encouraged to share their access needs, and then working together in community to figure out how to best actually meet those needs. So, these days I'm thinking a lot about what it means, for example, to provide a variety of different ways, thinking about how to access programming, remote access, programs that don't assume people always have to physically be in the building in order to belong. But as I step back and kind of think about access, I want to take us back to a kind of Jewish text for thinking here about some of these questions. And that's the Moses story. I've been in Loving Our Own Bones, I think a lot about the story of Moses, and particularly the way in which one of Moses's first interactions with God is an interaction that centers, right? So Moses, the greatest prophet in Jewish tradition, one of his first encounters and interactions with God centers on kind of an access question. In Exodus 4, when God sends Moses, gets ready to send Moses out to speak to Pharaoh, Moses says no, right? I mean, spoiler alert, the text, I just quoted one line from Exodus 4:10 here, where on the handout in text 3, where Moses describes himself as having never been a man of words. He describes himself as slow of speech and slow of tongue. The Hebrew is really beautiful here. Actually, he uses a word. The phrase is related to heaviness, right? A sense that his tongue is unwieldy, and it's often described in classical Jewish texts or by traditional commentators as saying that Moses had a stutter or some other kind of speech disability. So it's a really significant moment here in the beginning of Exodus when Moses says no to God's call because he doesn't feel able to speak. And I think, as a disabled person myself, I think I read this text in a couple of different ways. On the one hand, I think there's something really painful to me here in this text. I think about it as almost a moment of internalized ableism. Moses thinking, I'm not good enough a speaker, I shouldn't do it. I shouldn't be the one to go. I'm like, oh, that hits home. That hits home. But I think there's also a way in which we might read Moses as there being a really astute, making a really astute assessment about ableism in action, saying, God, you're looking for someone to speak your words in the world. I know this world is brutal, right? And often disregards and disdains the voice, the words, the message of people like me, right? In that sense, I think it's, for me, a both and here. Moses is both, right, perhaps affected by internalized ableism and also, right, reflecting back the ableism that is rampant in both his world and ours. One of the extraordinary things that happens as this text unfolds is that God actually offers Moses accommodations. It's a moment that the scholar disability studies scholar Bonnie Gracer calls the first reasonable accommodation in the Torah. When God says, okay, fine, take your brother, right? And Aaron becomes the revoicer. It's actually a practice that a lot of disabled folks with speech disabilities use today, right? Having a kind of intimate friend, sibling, person who knows their speech really well, revoice, speak after them, so that folks who are less familiar with the particular tenor and quality of their speech, right, are able to get the significance of the communication. And of course, this is a really powerful, right? It's a really powerful moment. But it's also a moment that in some ways I find a little bit unsettling. And I want to set this moment alongside a different paradigm of access, which happens earlier, earlier in Exodus chapter 4. And that's when God gives Moses the signs. Right? There's a way in which when the reasonable accommodation rests on the idea that Moses really does need to be a speaker like everyone else, right? He needs Aaron to do the thing, right? To make his speech intelligible in a kind of to fit into a normative framework. What's, I think, for me, even more transformative is the fact that God also, though, gives Moses a series of signs to communicate with the people, as though saying effectively, right? Moses, sure, there's moments when you're going to need to fit that normative, right? That or fit into the box, right? You're going to be in a wicked city where there's only one bed, right? And we'll try to equip you with the tools, AKA your brother, right? To be able to navigate that narrow space. But the place that really lands for me is this other moment where Moses is invited not to be a normative speaker, but to really, right, to be gifted the signs that invite him to use his own, right, first language, a nonverbal language, to communicate. I said that this moment with the, put another text on our handout here, text for a classic midrash about Moses, which also picks up on this question of Moses's speech. I bring this, just a fair warning, I find this to be a difficult text, so if you need to brace up a little bit, feel free to do so. This is a text with which I have I often look for texts. I often find myself drawn toward texts where I have a little bit of friction. This is definitely one where I feel some friction. This is a place, the text, where the Midrash asks, what became of Moses's speech disability? Right? Early on in Exodus, we see Moses equipped with Aaron. But we never really hear more about either Moses's speech disability. We don't see Aaron working specifically in this role. And it leads the Midrash to ask, what gives? Midrash Tanhuma draws a striking contrast between that verse that we looked at in Exodus 4:10, where Moses says, I am not a man of words, and the beginning of Deuteronomy. In fact, virtually the entire book of Deuteronomy is given over to Moses speaking nothing but words, right? Words after words after words. And the Midrash says, what gives, right? And then this is the part that makes my heart sink. One of the rabbis says, oh, maybe Moses, right? Through contact with Torah, Moses was healed. I find it very painful because I find it to be a place where, we see the Midrash engaging in a kind of curative imaginary, right? Moses becomes a great speaker because his disability is erased or left behind, right? Or rendered irrelevant. Right? For so many disabled folks, I think this is a very powerful message that, a very ubiquitous, a terrible but ubiquitous message that appears over and over in culture, right? Shrink down your disability, minimize it, hope for healing, hope for erasure, right? Hope to pass, hope to be normal again. And so for myself, and when I read this book, when I read this text, I read it with a counter story. I think Rabbi Yitzhak imagines a kind of healing at the heart of this story, that Moses himself is transformed, that Moses becomes a fluid, non-stuttering speaker. But when I read this text, I imagine it differently. When I read that contrast between what happens for Moses, what happens for the community, one of the things that really lands for me is the fact that I imagine Moses in the book of Deuteronomy stuttering his way, right, through the entire last book of the Torah, beautifully, without shame, right, speaking in his own disabled voice, giving us that prophecy. And I imagine his community has finally changed and transformed into a community that can recognize, listen to, learn from, engage with the words of Torah that he offers, the disabled Torah that he offers. For me, that's the place where I land when I think about who bears the responsibility, right, for making the change. Right? So often, dominant paradigms assume that it's disabled folks, right, who should twist or shrink or change or adjust, right, or bring a support person, or, like all of the work of sort of accommodating the too tight space. Right? The healing, the change, the transformation, right, is the transformation of the individual body to match or meet or at least approximate a non-disabled norm. But for me, the work of liberation comes in actually shifting those expectations, putting the onus on the community, right? to change the parameters, to shift and crack open the space. When this work of collectively shifting, right, who carries the burden and who does the work, right, asks the community at large, right, to develop a practice of openness, of flexibility, of ongoing disability, learning and embrace, right, in order to create a space that makes possible the full, meaningful, deep, right, engagement of disabled folks as we are in our cultural and communal spaces. So I'll just pause there and see, happy to take your questions, reflections, thoughts, reactions. If you want to, respond to any of the texts, you're welcome to, but also just happy to kind of leave a little bit of space to think through how this resonates for you, or what questions, thoughts it's raising in terms of your own practice and your own experience. Orna.
I'll jump in with I love everything you said, and living in the real world is very complicated. So I happen to work in particular with early childhood centers, and I hear these are people who, able-bodied, not able-bodied, whatever, like everyone is on the struggle bus in early childhood. And I forget who said, I don't want to take credit, but somebody very beautifully stated, like in Jewish communal service work, we're all expected to work, 100 hours a day, and 8 days a week. And there is a story that we're hearing again and again in these early childhood centers that the youngest members of the workforce, the Gen Z folks, have grown up during the pandemic and self-care and giving themselves space and mental health days, which on the one hand, beautiful, and we should all learn from that. And on the other hand, it's throwing their staffing into chaos because they're not structured in a way that they can have, 3 people out each day because they feel like they need a mental health day. And so what do we need to, as leaders, think about in terms of budgeting and structure and expectations and delivery of our products, right?
Yeah.
In this case, like caring for your child, while also maintaining sanity and respect for all of the different abilities and disabilities among us.
It's such a crucial question. It's such a crucial question. I'm so glad that you're asking it, and particularly appreciating the way that you're framing it in terms of thinking about what does it mean from a structure, staff, because I think that part of what it means is a kind of collaborative, overlapping kind of model of, and this is something that's been really interesting to me as I watch the way that disability communities and disability communal organizations at their, let's say, at their best, right? Some of the moments where I see things working well. One of the things that is really interesting to me, particularly seeing this among folks working particularly with chronic illness or other dynamic disabilities, right? Where it's often quite difficult to know moment to moment, day to day, week to week, what a given individual person's capacity will be, right? That often this model of partnering, pairing, overlapping, right? Right. So that expectation that one person will be solely responsible for, in your case, a group of kids or a particular space, is a model that's feels inherently vulnerable, right? It's a model that assumes that person is going to show up day in and day out and always be able to do their thing, right? And I think that working deeply in disability community makes me feel quite distrustful of that model. Right? I mean, I think it's very hard to know how to shift into other. I mean, I wish I had a sort of bulleted list of here's the 10-point plan of how to make this happen. But this is one of the things that I feel is such these are such urgent conversations and places for exploration. Right? I mean, I'm actually really interested in the way that, right, teaching partnerships, collaborative, like, I mean, I've been seeing some really interesting things unfolding in relation to kind of like job sharing and things like that. I'm curious about all of that. And it feels to me from a disability perspective, a really interesting way to think about, like, I don't want to see us just go back to a model where everybody comes, like, shows up at work regardless of how they feel and whether or not they're sick. Like, I don't think that was a good plan to start with, right? And certainly, you know, so I think that that really leads me to be interested in exploring these kind of forms of more collective, more collaborative. Of course, interpersonally, though, it's also still difficult. Like if one, you know, party ends up carrying more, right? How does that then balance out? How does that shift? I think also one of the things I'm really noticing in disability-centered organizations and workspaces is a kind of rethinking about, like, how much is actually necessary, right? Can they, I mean, this kind of takes me back to my initial Shabbos story, right? Where for the first year or so that I was keeping Shabbos, I just assumed I could still do the same amount, right? In 6 days, and given myself the 7th to relax. And of course, like when I say it this way, of course, it's obvious that that is not possible. And yet, I think that this is also part of what's at play, or not, in the question that you're asking, right? Like, is more always better? So I've been really interested. I spent a lot of time working in higher education. I've been really interested in the way that I'm seeing, for example, some student centers, Hillel's disability cultural centers, spaces begin to rethink a sort of culture of like incessant programming, right? In order of like putting more resources toward like creating other looser, gentler, like care-centered spaces for students? I think it's a very interesting question. And I feel like it's also here coming out of this, maybe a different kind of reflection of like, what's actually involved, right? What's necessary? I'm thinking about one of the one of the comments somebody said about the like culture of there's too much work, right? And so one way of thinking that is, well, somebody has to do it, right? But I think another way of thinking about it is like, is all of the work actually always necessary? So sometimes it's sort of paring down of a question of what do we have the human, I hate to say human resources because that's been like, but what do we have the capacity for? I think that's also one of the questions that feels really worth centering. I've started when I do trainings with with organizations thinking particularly about justice work, right? So often people feel this like utter unspeakable obligation, like this obligation to do so much, right? And so the hard question of like, what can this group do now well, right, is I think also about like saying, actually, we can't do that, right? There is a kind of need to lovingly, gently, carefully pull back to sort of think about, okay, this is what we really have the resources to do. Are there other questions, thoughts, reflections? Jacob?
Yes, I'm also aware of the time, and I know there's more on the text sheet, so I don't want to take up too
No,
much
you're
of your
fine. You're
time.
fine.
Okay.
I use that last text as a closing.
Oh, lovely. Okay, then I will be even briefer than before. I appreciate you bringing to this text to this conversation because it made me think about it in multiple new ways, which I had not thought about before. Initially, I always saw it as God in this moment trying to force this man to execute something knowingly beyond his means. And ultimately make Moses beg for some help, is how I always saw it. And I got very frustrated in their dynamic. But now I see it as, at least in two, if not opposing, at least two complementary ways. In that one, this conversation in which Sierra brought a speaker to us early on when this work first started being elevated at JCC Association, in that sometimes you prepare these things and the disability inclusion portion is tacked on at the end, which is something that happens, unfortunately, far more often than not. And so I see it in this way at first as like this idea that God comes down to Moses and says, it's the first time that my voice has not laid dormant in almost 400 years. Who wouldn't want this job? Who wouldn't want this job? And then suddenly is scrambling to find Aaron as the mouthpiece for Moses's journey. Or on the other hand, which I never had thought about before, was this idea that if God just said, "Hey, Moses, I know where you are. I know where you're at. I've already solved it. Aaron's going to speak on your behalf, and you don't have to do anything." And while that may seem great at first, it really removes Moses's agency from deciding where he is at. And I think having Aaron as this backup plan, while still offering this tremendous opportunity to Moses and meeting him where he is at, I think is so fascinating. So finding this balance in real life, or at least in the contemporary life, is very challenging when it comes to organizing something for all peoples. But it was just so fascinating to hear this moment that I was either, oh, I didn't think about this ahead of time, or meeting Moses where he was at in this journey. So I really appreciate you bringing this text and being able to extrapolate it into how we think about our spaces as well.
Oh, my beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you. That's really, I love that. If you have a chance to read the chapter on Moses right in my book where I talk about it, I'll give you just a little glimpse. There's also a whole part of the story where I think we might also see God as having God's own access needs here and needing Moses, right, to get out there, right, and then experiencing some frustration when Moses is like, no, I can't show, right? So it's a really complex, beautifully intricate story that involves, in my reading, a whole lot of negotiation around different access needs. So as promised, just in closing, I wanted to share a passage from the brilliant disability justice organizer Mia Mingus, queer Korean American disabled thinker, who talks really powerfully about the way that it's easy to get stuck thinking about access in terms of logistics. Mia Mingus talks about the way that access and the work of doing access intimacy is work that moves, it's a quote here, moves the work of access out of the realm of only logistics and into the realm of relationships, and understanding disabled people as humans, not burdens. Disabled people's liberation cannot be boiled down to the logistics. Jacob, I think it actually really connects beautifully with what you were just saying about that, like, intricate, complicated, difficult dance that is actually at its heart profoundly relational, right? About meeting another person, right? Engaging a person before you, recognizing that the relationship is actually often the most important thing. I like to say access isn't just about what we do. It's also about how it feels. So often disabled folks are made to ask for access, to push for it, to beg for it, to negotiate for it over and over and over again. Or we're left to apologize for it, to feel like we're the problem, the complication, the costly thing, the source of the awkwardness. And so one of the most powerful things I think that we can do when we are in the position, right, of working with someone around access needs, right, offering access, one of the most powerful things we can do is to put the problem properly where it belongs, on the systems, structures, norms, and expectations, not on the person. Everyone has access needs. Some people's access needs, though, get normalized and accommodated as part of our everyday ways of being in the world, and other people's access needs get stigmatized, marked out as special or too much trouble or too expensive. And so when I talk about access, right, I think access is a communal responsibility, a commitment to showing up for each other as we are, and a commitment to building a world that cherishes us, actually, truly, fiercely. Thank you all so very much. It was a huge pleasure to get to study Centaura together today, to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much for sharing and contributing and being a part of the conversation so wholeheartedly. What a pleasure to get to learn together.
Wonderful. Julia, thank you so much for your words and your wisdom and leading us in this incredible learning together today. And I really hope everyone on the call and those who also had to jump off a little early really gain something from this conversation, a new perspective or way of thinking about the work of accessibility and inclusion that you can take back with you into the work that you're doing every day in your community. And again, want to give thanks to Julia for leading this important conversation. And I just will share my screen once again very briefly to share with you all the next program we have for JDAAIM this month. We will be having another program on February 28th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern. I'll put in the chat the link to register. This will be an opportunity to learn more about the beautiful poster series that we have, thanks to an incredible artist named Sharoni Siboney. She'll be joining us for that conversation to talk a bit more about the artwork she created for the 8 Guiding Principles on Inclusion, and to share ways where you can highlight these beautiful pieces of art in your centers. So please join us for that conversation later in the month. Thank you all so much for being here. Julia, thank you again. And the recording will be sent out to everyone in just a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.